Long before the gladiators stepped into the sunlight and the roar of tens of thousands shook the stone walls of the Colosseum, Rome's arenas were already saturated with fear, anticipation, and an undercurrent of brutality that defined the empire's identity. To understand what truly happened after the battles, how prisoners, especially women, were treated, you must first understand the world that shaped these events. Rome's public spectacles were not simply entertainment, they were political demonstrations, psychological warfare, and social conditioning rolled into a single display of controlled savagery. The arena was the beating heart of Roman power. Emperors relied on gladiatorial games to win loyalty, distract the masses, and remind them of imperial dominance. The phrase panem et circenses, bread and circuses, was not a casual figure of speech. It represented a deliberate strategy: feed the people, entertain them, and they will not question the system that rules them. This made the games far more than sport. They were theater, propaganda, and ritualized violence designed to impress upon every spectator the invincibility of Rome. Before a game, crowds from every walk of life, slaves, merchants, soldiers, nobles, and even senators, flooded into the amphitheaters across the empire. In the Coliseum, over 50,000 spectators squeezed onto stone benches. Vendors moved through the aisles selling food, wine, and trinkets. Children clung to their parents. Friends argued over which gladiator would triumph. The air was hot, dusty, and electric with anticipation. Yet below this festive surface, far from the sunlight, a completely different atmosphere unfolded. Deep underneath the arena floor lay the Hypogeum, a maze of tunnels, cages, and wooden platforms. It was a world of shadows, torchlight, and the stench of animals, sweat, and damp stone. Gladiators waited here, pacing like caged predators. Prisoners, men, women, and even children captured in Rome's endless wars, were also kept in cramped cells, guarded by handlers and soldiers. Some had already been sold into servitude, some were awaiting transportation to slave markets, and others were destined for the staged spectacles that Rome admired so much. The contrast between the roaring audience above and the trembling silence of the captives below could not have been more extreme. While citizens celebrated the upcoming spectacle, the prisoners could hear every cheer echoing through the stone, each sound a reminder that their lives were no longer their own. For many female prisoners, the uncertainty was worse than the fear of death. Would they be sold, forced into servitude, used for entertainment, assigned to an owner, or led onto the arena floor as part of the day's spectacles? They knew nothing, and that uncertainty was itself a tool of psychological domination. The Romans believed that violence purified society. Bloodshed in the arena symbolized the empire's willingness to crush enemies and impose order through force. Public executions of criminals and prisoners reinforced this belief. Gladiator contests, beast hunts, and reenactments of famous battles fed the citizens' hunger for drama. And the more Rome's empire expanded, the more captives it accumulated. Captives who became the raw material for its cruel entertainment industry. The games began early in the day, often with animal hunts. Exotic beasts captured from the far reaches of the empire. Tigers from Asia, lions from Africa, bears from the mountains, were starved beforehand to make them more savage in the arena. They were released from underground cages using intricate pulley systems. The prisoners waiting below could hear the beasts growling long before the audience did. After the hunts came public punishments and executions, many involving prisoners of war or slaves accused of crimes. Rome used them to demonstrate that outsiders, especially conquered people, were disposable. Women were not exempt from these displays. Some were forced into staged mythological scenes where their deaths were dramatized for entertainment. The line between spectacle and cruelty vanished completely. But nothing compared to the arrival of the gladiators. When the trumpets blared and the gates swung open, the crowd erupted into a frenzy. Gladiators were the superstars of the arena, celebrated, bet upon, idolized, and feared. Their names were shouted from the stands. They were slaves, yet paradoxically among the most revered figures in Roman culture. Victories brought them privileges, favor, and temporary elevation above other enslaved people. And those privileges often came at the expense of prisoners held in the arena's dark corners. To the audience, a gladiator's victory was a triumph of bravery, strength, and Roman values. To the people waiting below, it was a reminder that brutality was rewarded. Every slain opponent, every cheer, every demand for mercy or death, these were signals that Rome valued domination above all else. The atmosphere inside the arena was overwhelming. Dust hung in the air. Blood seeped into the sand. The sun beat down mercilessly. When a gladiator made a killing blow, the ground sometimes visibly shuddered beneath the feet of those watching, as if the arena itself were alive and hungry. The slain fighter's body might be dragged away, or if it had value, carried off for ritual preparation. The victor raised his weapon high, basking in the adoration of thousands. Yet, for all its glamour, the victory was part of a system built on cruelty. After the fight, victorious gladiators passed back into the darkness under the arena, where the crowd could not see what happened next. And it was there, out of sight, away from the controlled pageantry, that Rome's true brutality unfolded. For the prisoners listening from their cells, every sound told a story. The thunderous cheers above could mean another death. The clanking of chains signaled movement. The rumble of the wooden elevators indicated animals or fighters being brought up, or bodies being brought back down. Guards walked with heavy steps, talking casually about the chaos above, knowing that the prisoners could hear but had no power. Female prisoners experienced this environment through layers of fear, vulnerability, and isolation. They were reminders of conquest, spoils taken from defeated tribes or rival nations. Rome's treatment of them varied depending on the region they came from, their age, their perceived value, and the demands of those in power. But one thing was consistent. In the arena system, they were commodities first, human beings second. This world of noise, dust, blood, and human desperation formed the backdrop of everything that happened after gladiators won their battles. The arena, with all its drama and spectacle, was only the surface. The real Roman brutality, the part Rome tried to hide, occurred beneath, in the shadows where female prisoners waited, caught between the empire's hunger for entertainment and the desires of the men who emerged victorious. To understand the fate of female prisoners in Rome's brutal entertainment system, one must look far beyond the arena. Their suffering did not begin under the Coliseum, nor did it start on the auction blocks of Rome. It began on the battlefields, on the smoking ruins of conquered cities, in the chaos of collapse, and in the relentless advance of Rome's war machine. Every Roman conquest followed a pattern carved deeply into the empire's identity. First came the legions, disciplined and merciless. Next came the auxiliary forces, sweeping through the countryside. And finally, in the aftermath of victory, came the gathering of captives. Men were rounded up, shackled and separated. Women and children followed, often herded together under guard. In Rome's eyes, these captives were not people, they were assets, trophies of conquest, and living proof of Roman supremacy. Female prisoners came from countless nations and cultures: Gauls, Britons, Carthaginians, Greeks, Jews, Egyptians, Syrians, Thracians, and more. Each group carried its own stories, languages, and customs, but Rome made no distinction. Once a woman was captured, her identity was erased and replaced with a single reality: she now belonged to the empire. The journey from battlefield to Rome was long and punishing. Chains, hunger, exhaustion, and uncertainty followed the women every step of the way. Some were bound together in groups, walking for weeks or months under the watchful eyes of Roman soldiers. Others were transported by sea, packed into the dark holds of ships carrying plunder, supplies, and human cargo. Many never survived the journey. Those who did arrived not as citizens or individuals, but as units of property measured by weight, skill, appearance, and potential value. Upon reaching Roman territory, female prisoners entered an economic system that treated their bodies and labor as commodities. Slave traders evaluated them with cold calculation, deciding who would be sent to household work, who would be sold to wealthy families, who would be used for manual labor, and who, often the youngest or the physically strongest, would be transported to the arenas. The Roman slave market was a place of noise, commerce, and casual cruelty. Traders shouted prices while crowds gathered to inspect newly arrived captives. Women stood on display platforms as buyers walked around them, judging posture, strength, age, and health. They were given symbolic signs around their necks identifying their origin or quality. Their pasts, families, friendships, homes meant nothing. What mattered was their use. Some female prisoners were sent to domestic service in wealthy Roman homes. There they cooked, cleaned, embroidered, cared for children, or performed tasks demanded by their owners. Though not safe from abuse, these women at least lived in more stable environments. Others were assigned to harsh agricultural labor under relentless supervision, working long hours in vineyards, estates, or mines. These women often faced exhausting labor with little hope of freedom, but a separate and more precarious fate awaited those sent to the arenas. Women destined for amphitheaters entered a world where they had no agency, no legal protection, and no predictable fate. Rome did not treat them according to any consistent system. Instead, their value shifted based on the whims of arena masters, lannisti, gladiator trainers, and the economic needs of the games. Some female captives were used as attendants or servants in gladiator schools. They swept training grounds, carried supplies, prepared equipment, or tended to minor tasks. Though physically safer than fighting, they were trapped in environments dominated by violence, injured fighters, and constant tension. Others were kept in holding cells beneath the amphitheaters, where they were used as part of the logistical machinery that supported gladiatorial events. These women lived in the shadow of the arena, a world of echoing chains, creaking wooden elevators, and the growls of starving animals waiting to be unleashed above. They listened to the thunder of the crowd every day. They watched wounded gladiators being carried through corridors. They saw prisoners dragged toward the arena floor for executions or staged battles. Their daily existence was defined by unpredictability and fear. Ironically, the closer they were to the gladiators themselves, the more complex their lives became. Gladiators, though slaves, were celebrities. Crowds adored them, wealthy women sought them, and arena owners rewarded them. For female prisoners, this strange hierarchy often meant that gladiators held power over those who technically shared their enslaved status. Some female captives were assigned as laborers in gladiator barracks. Others were kept in adjacent quarters where their roles fluctuated based on demand and circumstance. The psychological torment on these women was immense. They were trapped between the brutality of Roman authority and the fierce reputation of the gladiators. Every arena victory, every roar from the stadium above, threatened to shift their fate at any moment. They had no idea when or if they would be sold again, reassigned, punished, or chosen for a role they did not want. Historians and archaeologists have pieced together fragments of their experiences from inscriptions, tools, writings of Roman critics, and the architectural layout of amphitheaters. What emerges is a picture not of isolated incidents, but of a systematic structure where female captives were used in ways Rome later tried to erase, or simply refused to record at all. Roman historians loyal to the empire preferred to glorify battles and emperors, not confront the reality of how prisoners were treated. When accounts do surface, they are often from philosophers, foreign observers, or early Christian writers who condemned the violence of the games. Even these sources hint more than they describe, for fear of offending powerful patrons. What is CE? Artane is that female captives existed in a permanent state of vulnerability. Their value could rise or fall by the day. They might be treated as laborers one week and reassigned to the arena's underbelly the next. They were at the mercy of a system that celebrated strength, domination, and spectacle, and viewed them as interchangeable and disposable. Still, these women experienced moments of resistance, quiet resilience, and shared solidarity. In the dark corridors beneath the arenas, they formed bonds with each other. They helped care for the sick, shared food when they could, whispered to calm the terrified younger captives, and passed fragments of their old cultures down through stories. These small acts of humanity, though invisible to Roman records, kept pieces of their identities alive. Yet despite their endurance, most female prisoners did not leave behind names or recorded stories. They lived and died in silence, overshadowed by the roar of the crowds above them and erased by an empire that preferred to celebrate its glory rather than confront its cruelties. Their suffering formed the unseen backbone of Rome's entertainment culture, a truth that makes what happened after gladiators won their battles even more unsettling. The power imbalance, the environment of violence, and the systematic dehumanization shaped a world where horrors could unfold without consequence. To understand what happened to prisoners, especially women, after gladiators won their battles, one must first understand the gladiators themselves. They were symbols of power, but also victims of the very system that glorified them. Their victories shaped their privileges, and their privileges shaped the fate of those around them. Yet behind every cheer that crowned them as heroes stood a reality far more conflicting. Gladiators were both admired and imprisoned, feared and exploited, honored and dehumanized. The paradox of the gladiator began the moment he entered the ludus, the gladiator school. These were not schools in the modern sense, but prison training camps ruled with military discipline and ruthless efficiency. A newly captured man, whether a criminal, a war prisoner, or a slave bought for the arena, was stripped, inspected, branded, and catalogued. Then he was given a status lower than even Rome's common slaves. He was property meant to die for entertainment. Inside the ludus, the Lannister, the gladiator master, was the ultimate authority. His word was law. He determined who trained, who fought, who lived, and who was expendable. Though often despised by Roman aristocrats for running a business considered morally corrupt, the Lannister wielded enormous influence behind the scenes. He controlled the fighters, the schedules, the punishments, and the rewards. He also decided what privileges a victorious gladiator received after a fight. Training was brutal. Gladiators rose before sunrise, drilled for hours with weighted weapons, practiced footwork until their muscles trembled, and sparred under the eyes of strict instructors known as doctors. Every movement had to be precise. Every mistake could be fatal later in the arena. Despite their harsh conditions, gladiators formed brotherhoods. They ate together, trained together, and shared the fear of stepping into the arena. Among themselves, they called each other brothers of the sword. Within this contained world, rumors circulated constantly. Rumors about upcoming matches, secret rivalries, changes in Roman politics, and the arrival of new captives. Female prisoners, especially those assigned to work in or near these schools, were often aware of the fighters' reputations long before they ever saw them. A gladiator known for savage victories earned a reputation followed by fear. A gladiator known for mercy earned respect. A gladiator defeated repeatedly lived with the shadow of execution hanging over him. Yet despite their slavery, gladiators carried a strange kind of power, one fueled not by freedom, but by fame. The Roman crowd adored them. Women of high status sought them in secret. Children mimicked their battles. Merchants carved their names into souvenirs, and emperors themselves used them as tools to sway public opinion. A victorious gladiator could win the crowd's loyalty faster than a politician giving a speech. This fame, however, came with consequences. Gladiators became both desired and feared. The public saw them as exotic, hyper-masculine symbols of violence and strength. Their victories elevated them temporarily above other enslaved people, giving them privileges that would later become crucial in determining the fate of prisoners who fell under their influence. A lanista might reward a victorious fighter with better food, better living quarters, or temporary access to entertainment and services normally denied to enslaved people. Victories were currency. Power, respect, and influence rolled into one, but gladiators were not free to decide their own futures. Every privilege was conditional. Every reward could be taken away. Every act of disobedience resulted in brutal punishment. Some fighters bore scars not from the arena, but from disciplinary whips and chains used by their superiors. The Lannister ensured that even the most celebrated warrior never forgot his place. Still, for a captive woman living in the orbit of the arena, a gladiator's victory mattered. A victorious fighter returned from the arena with heightened status among fellow gladiators and increased freedom within the confines of the ludus. He might be permitted access to areas often restricted, including holding rooms where prisoners were kept temporarily. The imbalance of power was immense. A man, who had just been cheered by thousands, stood before prisoners who existed in complete silence, hidden from public view. To understand how gladiators treated prisoners, one must understand their psychology. Gladiators lived with constant fear of death, fear of failure, fear of punishment, fear of obscurity. Many fought simply to survive another day. Others fought to win the wooden sword of freedom, known as the rudis, a symbol that ended their slavery forever. Only a tiny percentage earned this reward. Most died young. This constant pressure hardened them. Some became numb to suffering. Others developed a twisted sense of identity shaped by their unwavering need to dominate or be dominated. Many lived without family, affection, or dignity, conditions that distorted their sense of power and interaction with others, especially those with even less authority than themselves. For female prisoners living near gladiators, this environment was suffocating. They were surrounded by men trained to kill, men conditioned to view life as a commodity, men celebrated for brutality. Even if a gladiator showed compassion, he possessed the physical and social power to assert control instantly. The fate of women in such an environment depended not on laws, since they had none to protect them, but on the character, mood, and desires of the men who held power. But it would be a mistake to imagine gladiators as uniformly cruel. The reality was far more complex. Some fighters, shaped by their own suffering, treated prisoners with humanity. Others treated them with indifference. And some, empowered by victory and encouraged by a system built on domination, abused the power granted to them. These variations, these moral differences between individual fighters, are part of what makes the history so troubling. The system allowed a range of outcomes, and all were hidden beneath the arena fell. The irony is that gladiators themselves were not free. They were instruments of entertainment, their lives controlled by Rome's thirst for blood. Their victories did not remove their chains, they merely decorated them. Their fame did not erase their status as property, it only made them more valuable. They, too, were victims of the empire's machinery of cruelty. And so in the end, the gladiator stands as a symbol of the entire Roman system, admired on the outside, rotting on the inside, celebrated in public, suffering in private, feared yet enslaved, powerful in the moment of victory, powerless in all other aspects of life. This conflicted identity shaped everything they did and everything they were permitted to do. Once the arena's sand had been wiped clean of blood and the crowds had gone home to understand the fate of the prisoners kept beneath Rome's arenas, especially female prisoners, you must descend into the world that few Romans ever saw, the enormous underground labyrinth beneath the Coliseum known as the Hypogeum. It was a place where the empire's darkest secrets were buried, a world of shadows, chains, and whispered orders, hidden beneath the blinding spectacle above. The Hypogeum was where men became beasts, beasts became weapons, and human lives were measured in minutes of entertainment. Walking into the Hypogeum meant stepping into a different reality entirely. The air was thick, damp, and heavy with the smell of sweat, blood, and old wood. Torches flickered in iron brackets along the walls, casting long shadows that moved like living creatures. Echoes traveled strangely here. Footsteps sounded distant one moment and disturbingly close the next. The constant hum of activity created a tension that never fully disappeared. Prisoners could hear the muffled roar of the crowd overhead, a reminder that thousands were celebrating while they waited in fear. The layout itself was a maze. Dozens of narrow corridors branched into holding cells, animal cages, storage rooms, staging platforms and mechanical chambers filled with winches and pulleys. The Romans engineered the Hypogeum with astonishing precision, turning it into a theatrical machine capable of producing some of the most elaborate spectacles the world had ever seen. Trapdoors opened suddenly, elevators creaked upward, carrying fighters or animals to the arena floor. Cages slid along rails. Everything was designed to create surprise and drama above. But behind this engineering brilliance was a system of human suffering. Several kinds of people were kept in the Hypogeum: gladiators waiting for their fights, condemned criminals awaiting execution, wild animals starved to make them more aggressive, and prisoners, men and women captured in Rome's wars. The female prisoners lived in a unique type of terror. They were not slated for combat, yet they were forced to witness the machinery of violence every day. The fear of being reassigned, sold, punished, or dragged into an unknown role was a constant shadow. A typical day in the Hypogeum began long before the crowds arrived. Guards marched through the corridors, checking locks, inspecting cages, and shouting orders. Prisoners were awakened abruptly, often by the sound of chains or the sharp clang of metal being dragged across stone. Workers prepared props, sharpened weapons, and fed the animals. Female captives were given menial tasks, cleaning bloodstains from previous events, hauling buckets of water, distributing rations, or maintaining the torches. These tasks, though simple, were physically demanding, especially under the threat of punishment for any mistake. The female prisoners witnessed scenes that would haunt them forever. They saw lions pacing in their cages, growling with hunger. They saw gladiators practicing thrusts and blocks with wooden swords, striking with terrifying force even in training. They saw condemned men being tied to poles, prepared for executions that were sometimes ritualistic and symbolic. They heard the screams of those who begged, the resigned silence of those who accepted their fate, and the occasional brave defiance of those who refused to yield to Rome's cruelty. What made the Hypogeum especially terrifying was its unpredictability. Prisoners never knew when a soldier would appear at their cell door with new orders. Some were suddenly dragged off to assist in transporting props or to clean after fights. Others were taken to be displayed in the triumphal processions that preceded certain games. At times, prisoners were moved simply because a lanista or arena master decided they were needed elsewhere. A female captive might be in one section of the Hypogeum in the morning and in a completely different part by afternoon, without understanding why. One of the most chilling features of the Hypogeum was how little daylight reached it. Many prisoners went weeks without seeing the sun. Time lost meaning. The constant noise from above, the roar of crowds, the crack of whips, the triumphant horns announcing victories, became a cruel reminder that life continued above them without care or awareness of their suffering. The silence between events was almost worse. In those moments, the prisoners were alone with their thoughts, surrounded by the dark, haunted by what they had heard or witnessed. The architecture of the Hypogeum added to the oppressive feeling. The walls were thick and cold, the floors were uneven, worn down by the footsteps of thousands of prisoners, workers and fighters over the decades. Some corridors were so narrow that two people could barely pass each other. Others opened into larger chambers filled with cages or equipment. There were hidden rooms accessible only to guards and arena officials, rooms meant for storing weapons, securing dangerous prisoners, or preparing animals for release. Female prisoners often clung to each other for comfort. In the face of uncertainty, they formed bonds of mutual protection. They shared scraps of food, whispered stories from their homelands, and offered support to younger captives who broke down under the emotional strain. These small acts of solidarity helped them retain fragments of their identity in a place designed to strip it away. Yet their vulnerability was constant. In the hierarchy of the Hypogeum, female prisoners were near the bottom. They had no weapons, no training, no legal rights, and no allies within the system. They were watched by guards, scrutinized by trainers, ignored by officials, and occasionally noticed by gladiators passing through. Some gladiators treated them with indifference, others with a measure of kindness, and some exploited the power imbalance that governed every interaction in this underground world. But no matter how individuals behaved, the system itself did not protect these women. Rome had no laws safeguarding enslaved foreigners. Their fate depended on the whims of the men around them. What makes the Hypogeum even more disturbing is how Rome worked to keep its true nature hidden. Visitors to the Colosseum saw the grand marble structure, the statues, the emperor's box, and the vast arena. They never saw the tunnels beneath. Roman writers described the spectacle above: heroic fights, dramatic executions, legendary battles, but almost never acknowledged the human suffering taking place below. The underground world was deliberately ignored, its inhabitants remembered only when they appeared briefly on the arena floor. When the games ended for the day, the Hypogeum entered a strange silence. The crowds departed, merchants said their stalls, and the arena grew quiet. But beneath the ground, the prisoners remained in darkness, too exhausted to speak, too frightened to sleep deeply. They lay on straw mats, cold stone floors, or whatever surface they could find. Guards patrolled the corridors, their footsteps echoing ominously. Occasionally, a wounded gladiator was carried down on a stretcher, moaning in pain as a medicus tried to save him. The prisoners heard it all. The Hypogeum was a world without hope, where every day brought new uncertainties. It was a place where Rome hid the machinery of its entertainment industry, a place where the humanity of captives, especially women, was worn away by darkness, fear, and the constant threat of violence. And it was from this place of vulnerability that many female prisoners were taken when gladiators emerged victorious. Their fate was not written in laws or records, but in whispered stories, fragments of testimony, and the unspoken horrors that Rome tried desperately to keep out of history for all its grandeur, all its confidence, and all its military supremacy. Rome was deeply afraid of one thing: the truth about the vicious systems that sustained its power. No place embodied this fear more than the Colosseum and the other amphitheaters scattered across the empire. What happened inside those structures was meant to awe, entertain, and intimidate. What happened beneath them, the lives of prisoners, the suffering of men and women forced into brutality, the exploitative dynamics hidden from the public eye, was never meant to survive in written memory. Rome did not simply forget the darker details of its arenas, it buried them deliberately. The empire was built on carefully crafted narratives. Emperors controlled history as tightly as they controlled their armies. Official records, inscriptions, and public monuments emphasized Roman glory, courage, virtue, and order. The arena was portrayed as a symbol of these values, a place where Roman discipline triumphed over chaos, where heroes showcased skill, and where justice was carried out in the form of executions. But beneath this veneer of moral superiority was a system fueled not by justice, but by spectacle, domination, and fear. When critics, philosophers, poets, or political rivals attempted to expose the brutality of the games, they were often silenced, ridiculed, or ignored. The elite wrote the official version of events, and ordinary people had no means to challenge it. Whatever horrors took place beneath the sands of the Colosseum rarely made it into state-approved history. Still, faint traces of truth survived. A small number of ancient writers, Seneca, Juvenal, and later Christian chroniclers, hinted at the cruelty of the games. They described the treatment of prisoners as inhuman, the executions as barbaric, the atmosphere of the arena as morally corrupt. But even these accounts were incomplete, overshadowed by the overwhelming praise for Rome's entertainment culture. The truth was consistently minimized, diluted, or reframed as a necessary part of imperial power. The most inconvenient truths were those involving the treatment of women. The Romans prided themselves on being civilized. Their laws, their philosophy, and their architecture were presented as proof of their superiority. Admitting that female prisoners, foreigners, captives of war, enslaved women, were treated in dehumanizing ways would have shattered the image Rome presented to itself and the world. It would have contradicted the carefully curated myth that Romans upheld order, dignity, and moral discipline. So these stories were erased. It is telling that almost no official Roman document discusses what happened to female captives after the games, or how they were handled in the Hypogeum. Gladiators are mentioned in military records, in graffiti, in tombstone inscriptions. Managers of gladiator schools appear in contracts and business documents. But the prisoners, especially women, appear almost nowhere. They were considered too unimportant to record and too dangerous to acknowledge. For centuries, the silence was so complete that some historians even wondered whether the rumors of mistreatment were exaggerated. But the archaeological evidence, combined with surviving foreign accounts, paints a different picture. The absence of documentation was not accidental, it was designed. Rome mastered the art of historical sanitization. After the fall of the Western Empire, the rewriting continued. The early Christian Church, which had a complicated relationship with Rome's past, condemned the gladiatorial games as sinful and barbaric. Yet even the Church rarely described what happened to female prisoners in detail. The point of their criticism was moral superiority, not historical accuracy. They condemned the violence, but did not preserve the stories of the victims. Then came the Middle Ages, a time when many classical texts were lost, damaged, or copied selectively. Monks and scribes preserved works they considered valuable, mostly philosophical or political, rarely anything describing the daily lives of slaves or prisoners. Whole parts of Roman history, especially those concerning lower classes and non-citizens, simply vanished. By the Renaissance, scholars rediscovered the architectural magnificence of the Colosseum, praising its engineering and artistic symmetry. They marveled at its arches and geometry, but rarely looked into the darker realities buried beneath its stones. The Hypogeum was not even fully excavated until the modern era. For centuries, it remained literally and metaphorically buried, its secrets sealed by earth, time, and deliberate silence. Then, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, when archaeologists finally entered the underground chambers, their focus was on structures, not stories. They described the elevators, the animal cages, the drainage systems, the trapdoors. The human suffering behind these mechanisms was still overshadowed by fascination with Roman engineering. Only in recent decades have historians begun reconstructing the forgotten experiences of the vulnerable, women, slaves, foreign captives, and arena workers. And as they do, patterns emerge. Rome's suppression of truth was systematic, not episodic. It was a strategy of power. Rome needed the public to believe that the arena was a moral institution, that the games represented discipline, not chaos, that gladiators were heroes, not exploited fighters, that prisoners were criminals, not victims of imperial conquest, and that the empire itself stood for justice and order, not cruelty and domination. Admitting the truth would have destroyed that illusion. The suppression occurred in multiple forms. 1. Selective recording. Roman historians focused on emperors, generals, battles, and politics. Slaves and prisoners appeared only when they served a narrative. 2. Cultural justification. The Romans created moral arguments to justify violence. Executions were justice. Gladiatorial combat was training. Slavery was natural. Everything else was unworthy of documentation. 3. Architectural concealment. The Hypogeum itself was a cover-up. Spectators saw only the clean, staged version of reality. The suffering underground was hidden by design. 4. Post-empire sanitization. Christian writers condemned the games but preserved few details about the victims, prioritizing moral messages over historical facts. 5. Lost through time. Many texts written by critics, foreign observers, or victims simply did not survive. The result is a history full of missing voices, especially female voices. But silence itself is a form of evidence. The very absence of documentation speaks volumes about what Rome wanted to hide. Empires rarely record their own sins. The lack of records is not proof that crimes didn't happen. It is often proof that they did. Today, historians, linguists, archaeologists, and anthropologists are piecing together fragments, bone remains, inscriptions, weapon marks, architectural designs, and scattered writings, to reveal a truth Rome once tried to bury. Behind the glory of the Colosseum was a world of suffering that touched the lives of countless enslaved women whose names were never written and never meant to be remembered. And the fact that Rome worked so hard to silence their stories tells us just how horrifying those stories must have been.